I think most people would agree that the goal of landscape design is to change plots of land into landscapes that are appropriate for dwelling. And dwelling, I'm saying that's more than just living in a house or living in a home. This is home in the bigger context of being a person, being a human being on this planet. In other words, that really means to make place. But we still have to go back to think about what is a place, because what are we making when we're making place then? To me, I think places are physical and psychological or emotional environments where we feel grounded, belonging, and connected. If you're a philosophical person, maybe you have some idea of what place is, but this is my best definition that I can put together in words. So to evaluate the success of our collective placemaking, I invite you to ask yourself these questions. Do I feel grounded, belonging, and connected in the world? Do I feel at home in myself and in this world? And what do I observe in other people in this area? To answer those questions I just presented, I came up with this diagram to represent the state of our current social landscape. At the foundation of our collective humanity, I would say there are long-standing paradigms of unworthiness, not belonging, and scarcity, as illustrated in this kind of core center red hot subsurface. And these go back many centuries or even thousands of years, or maybe even as our whole development as human beings in civilization. But at the very least, I think they've been reinforced by dominant religious interpretations, institutional interpretations as well. But we'll start with the religious ones, particularly the Christian narrative of original sin and European worldviews since the Enlightenment, such as the mainstream adoption of mind-body dualism in Descartes' famous quote, "I think, therefore I am." Then we built social systems on top of that with this layer of topsoil, or more than topsoil, much deeper than that, to perpetuate these paradigms over the years through our economic, political, educational, and employment systems, as well as established social identities and norms. These systems push us into commodifying nature as economic resources and also ourselves as products of labor in order to establish cooperation, competition, or dominance over others based on our particular social identities. And if you've been in any way socially conscious in recent years, I'm sure you would have noticed the increase of upheaval of social destructions, particularly in racism, political radicalism, housing crisis, mental illness, etc. So I've actually illustrated here with this burning forest or burning trees. And I think of these as disruptions, the symptoms of our collective paradigms, basically our faulty psychosocial foundation wearing out and kind of revealing itself into the surface, into our very valuable nature, our human nature, ecological nature, our society, etc. There's lots of well-intended initiatives for social change, particularly within institutions. These structures, social structures of change happens in a very particular way, which I don't necessarily think are very effective, since they are actually built on faulty foundations, as illustrated metaphorically in this house built on a crack. Even if we're building a lot of the change that we want, we really have to get to the root of things in order to do something stable. And looming in the background, or much in the foreground for many people, is the phenomenon of climate change. When I look at this picture, I think, shouldn't we be working on this base layer, the paradigms of unworthiness, not belonging, and scarcity, and for people in the design profession, building on stable ground, looking at our geological stability before building all those structures of social change, before we can do a lot of surface work here. But until we get to this bottom layer, we're just going to keep repeating things over and over again. As I mentioned earlier, most of design professionals learn about their work through the discovery process. So whether that be formal education or informal education in the job. And so I want to get back into a little bit about what does it really mean to learn to be a design professional, because we're learning about placemaking. So what does it mean to learn to be a design professional? So I'm going to go into the idea of praxis, which is essentially putting theory into practice. Design is a form of practice. It's not just theory. It's actually putting practice, but using some sort of foundation to inform how we practice. So that makes design education the process of learning how to put the theory of placemaking into practice. But is the design theory we have sufficient for our times? And you may be thinking that I'm leading you on to think that the answer is no, our theory is insufficient. I'd have to say that my answer for you is not exactly so clear-cut. What I want to bring to your attention is that the relevant question of our times isn't about how much effort we've put into doing things the same way as we've always done before, but rather how willing are we in being open to a new way of doing things. That goes back to the concept of curiosity and shoushin. So we may be thinking of, oh, we need new theories, but I'm actually saying that we don't need new theories. The theories we need already exist, but we're just aren't making use of them, or at least not making use of them in the most effective ways. Instead of asking, how do we design our world, is really asking us to consider seriously, beyond very basic answers, the question, why do we design? Because when we ask that question, why do we design, in a deeper way, we come up with even bigger questions, deeper questions. Questions like, who are we? What is place? Why do we make places? And that's where philosophy and even spirituality comes in, because our inner knowing as human beings, our connection with the world, and the ancient wisdom that we've already attained through centuries has these answers. Our society is very obsessed with just getting answers immediately. But let's go back to the word practice, which really is about a process of repetition. Whatever practice you're doing, whether it's landscape design practice or some other professional practice, from a philosophical sense, it really doesn't mean having an instant answer. It's really about the goal of making place in this context, not by predetermining an answer to how we should design, but instead by continuously learning what makes a place and how we influence place through individual and collective experiences. I'm going to get into the motivational part of being a landscape architect. So perception and purpose, the role of being a landscape architect. I'm returning to my PhD research to address the question of why we make place. And the two keywords from my research, poignant and flourishing, are here to show us that there's a mutuality of a landscape architect's role. In the word poignant, we find the landscape architect as a human being. And here we receive something from the world. In the word flourishing, we find the human being as a landscape architect. And here we give back something to the world. The dynamic is mutual, like in the greater flourishing process. When I did this presentation originally, when it was set up, I was still considered officially a landscape architect. But now that I'm not, I still consider this as, because I kind of contextualize this with the idea of landscape architect as archetype. So you could be a real life landscape architect, or you can be an archetypal landscape architect. I think this still applies to us. How we live as human beings receiving something from the world, and also how we give back to the world with our roles, whatever our social roles or the work that we do. I'm going to go into the idea of poignant landscapes to landscape architects. What does that really mean? The word poignant has been an interesting word that has followed me around because it brings a lot of confusion to the people that I worked with, academic colleagues, and even some research participants were like confused by the idea of poignant landscapes. And I think what's important about the word poignant was because it was kind of confusing. People think of whether poignant landscapes needs to have particular characteristics. And indeed, there were certain characteristics that would be considered our biases, our shared biases of what it means to live in the world and have these profound moments in landscapes. But one major theme that I think is very important is the idea of connectedness, whether that's the connectedness to a place, to humans, or to more than human nature. These were part of the stories that I got from interview participants. I've just summed it down to a few points. This idea of connectedness could come into examples of feeling totally immersed in a place, opening to the awareness of being part of a greater nature, noticing elements in nature that have been taken for granted, being moved by how one's actions have affected others. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a place in the context of an environment. It could be an emotional environment, you'd say, between two or more people. On the other hand, there were examples of the opposite scenario where the awareness of not being connected, that is not finding place or not being at home, metaphorically or physically. And those were usually accompanied by fear or another source of emotional pain. What I can conclude out of this is that poignant landscapes are something more experiential than material. I'm going to move to the other side and look at what does it mean to flourish according to landscape architects. Here are some of the most common characteristics. To start, it was to have integrity, to know where you stand ethically and have internal principles that do not waver under external circumstances. One particular one that I can share that someone mentioned was to serve the public good, serving the public good before serving private interests. To bring that integrity into the world, you need courage. So the second item here is to have courage. To be committed to your integrity, you have to have courage to stand up to external pressures or to be innovative that may pressures against your integrity. The third item I have here is to be contributive. Many people go into professions like landscape architecture or environmental design or environmental or social related professions because of the idea of making a difference in the world. And in this area, it's to help improve ecological or social conditions. In a way, you could think of it as creating a sense of home, whether physically, emotionally, or spiritually, for humans or more than human species in the case of natural habitats. And behind the idea of being contributive is the idea of offering and not obligation, because we often think of responsibility as a moral or ethical and moral part of being a professional for the public good. But that's not really part of the ethic of flourishing. Well, let's say it that way. We're coming from the idea of a judgment, responsibility as a guilt-ridden kind of thing. So it's really about contributing of what we have to offer. Another big aspect, though, is to communicate well, because landscape architects, someone said, they need to gain the trust of clients and users when listening to their needs and then translating these needs into a vision. And on top of that, to convey that the results will be satisfactory and also actually produce the results. On the other hand, there's a lot of teamwork and working with communities. So there's a need to find common ground to reconcile the differences between people in order to have a healthy collaboration. So the qualities needed in healthy communication are humility, awareness, and empathy. These are not things that you learn in professional development, because we're always, professional development is usually about skills and knowledge and things like that. But based on the discussions I had with people, these were common things: humility, awareness, and empathy, particularly empathy. And so I find that there is a disconnect between what is of value formally in associations and what's put out, particularly in continuing education, versus what people from their hearts thinks is important as a foundation to the profession. And lastly, I have here, have fun. People said having fun is a part of flourishing, because there's just not a lot of time to do all kinds of stuff if we're going to be responsible for everything. So investing in work that you enjoy and find fulfilling is important. If we want to kind of sum it up in a particular way, we could say that flourishing in landscape architecture can be considered not a goal towards a certain product, but it is a wholesome process. So why is poignant landscapes and an ethic of flourishing especially relevant to placemaking in the social landscape of our times? The answer is found in the meaning of the word poignant, which is the moment when pain meets beauty. For collective humanity, this is where unworthiness and unbelonging meets intrinsic worth and belonging. Poignant landscapes and human flourishing intersect when personal and collective plane, which we can broadly call trauma, heal and transition into the sense of belonging and worthiness in the world, which needs the existence of a physical and spiritual common ground where all and everyone is accepted, and also the need or a place where we can feel secure physically and existentially. So if landscape architecture's role is to make place, and place exists beyond the material world where there's acceptance and a common ground where everyone is accepted, then landscape architecture also plays a fundamental role in the pursuit of our common belonging and worthiness in the world. But what if we don't believe or know that we have received a gift from the world? What do we have to give back to the world? And in the case of poignant landscapes and flourishing in landscape architecture, then I have the question, what if you don't believe in the power of landscapes? That is our gift from the world. What do you have to give back to the world as a landscape architect? Whether that's a real life landscape architect or someone who is embodying the landscape architect archetype. That means anyone who has the goal to make the world a better place as a human being. I'm not asking these questions as part of a straw man's argument, because these are real. I have some real answers from real landscape architects when I asked them about how well do you think the profession of landscape architecture in North America is succeeding in making poignant landscapes. And they did not, or the ones that I picked out here at least, did not really think the idea of poignant landscapes was relevant to what they were doing. Everyday landscapes are not poignant. I prefer to make useful places in urban environments. I don't see us doing much of anything that could be poignant at that scale. Not much of our work falls into that category. Maybe try a different term. Much of the design out there is utilitarian, budget-strapped, and uninspired because the mandate for the work is not to inspire, but to fulfill basic functional needs. There are so many barriers to create meaningful space that sometimes I think it's sheer accidents when one actually works out. Only large projects have the budget and space to be poignant. The opportunity to provoke and create poignancy is rarely welcomed. From looking at these quotes, you can see that some people didn't think that there were any relevance to poignant landscapes to the profession. And others, you could say that they wanted to believe in the possibilities, but were resigned to the reality of their circumstances. We go back to the original question I brought. What is real landscape architecture? If that is the reality that they think, is there room for things to be not real or the ideal to come into reality? It's part of the way someone positions themselves in the work they do and whether they can see beyond that. I'm going to give you this contrast with one particular quote from an interview participants for comparison. I asked, do you see a role for poignant landscapes in landscape architecture? And they said, poignant. I think it's something that tugs at your heart. It's something that speaks to you. We're responsible for so many different things. I think we're responsible that natural communities will flourish and that human society flourishes without immersing ourselves in the emotions of others, without reaching out empathetically. Whatever we build, we can build anywhere. What makes it special is how the people who live in it, who work with it, who interact with it, feel about it. What she's talking here is the essence of place. What makes the work special is the people who live in it, work in it, and interact with it, and how they feel about it. And that involves relating empathetically to the people and people's need for place and belonging, which is very specific. If somebody is into research, the details of research, may notice that the questions were slightly different. When you have two different questions and different circumstances because of surveys and interviews, you can get a different result, of course. And I think that's true. It's not necessarily a fault of my research, but it's something that I brought to my own attention. And I think that's actually an important idea, because what I concluded out of this is that it's not really that important. The major finding, which should have been pretty obvious from the beginning, is that our perceptions of the world and our interpretations of these perceptions matter a lot. It's about seeing the perception out of what we get. And maybe sometimes it's asking the right questions in order to see a different perspective. Perception matters so much that systems theorist Fritjof Capra coined our modern predicament as a crisis of perception. And he says, as the 21st century unfolds, it is becoming more and more evident that the major problems of our time, energy, the environment, climate change, food security, financial security, cannot be understood in isolation. They are systemic problems, which means that they are all interconnected and interdependent. Ultimately, these problems must be seen as just different facets of one single crisis, which is largely a crisis of perception. It derives from the fact that most people in our modern society, and especially our large social institutions, subscribe to the concepts of an outdated worldview, a perception of reality inadequate for dealing with our overpopulated, globally interconnected world. And this is from the Systems View of Life, a unifying vision. As the saying goes, those who don't believe in magic will never find it. And I think that's from Roald Dahl. So I'm sharing you an answer from a landscape architect believer to inspire you, I guess. Same question, do you see a role for poignant landscapes in landscape architecture? And he says, how could you imagine the opposite? Imagine if there were none. What would you be doing? I can't imagine landscape architecture without poignant landscapes. Like, what else would we be doing? What else would we really be doing? Making certain things just work. I guess we'll just be making things work. That little part at the end really gets to me when I think about making things work. Are we just making things work in our lives? Can we do better than that? But to really frame that in a way that make things for us to change our thoughts, I'm going to reiterate the point from before that our perceptions matter. Our choice to perceive and interpret the world in a particular way matters. There's no other big thing that determines how reality is created. So the big questions to check in with our perception, which ultimately leads us to our choices, is, are we just making things work? And in this context, what kind of landscape architecture do we want to be doing? Do we want a landscape architecture that just works? What kind of research and teaching do we want to be doing? In a bigger context, do we want knowledge that just works? Knowledge that just works really doesn't get us very far. It's really turning knowledge into wisdom that really brings us much further into creating a better world. And lastly, what kind of life do we want to be living? The really big, important question here is, do we want a life that just works? I'm pretty sure that we don't want things to just work, even though sometimes many of us, including myself, act or think like that, or somehow prevents ourselves from doing otherwise. So even if greater society doesn't want or doesn't know how to address the faulty paradigms in our social foundation, we still continue to strive for change. And this includes the design professions wanting to make a difference. Generally, design professions want to believe that we can change the world through design, specifically through the design of physical and tangible spaces. But as I've shown here, I can say that the change that we actually want most as a society and as a human species can only be achieved when these spaces have the power to move us internally, reminding each of us that we do belong, are inherently worthy, and can be who we are as we are. This means the need to extend our focus from the external landscape to our internal landscapes. In supporting a flourishing world, we really have a mission to look at both the aspect of poignant, where pain meets beauty, unveiling the pain of our collective social ecological traumas, sharing the poignant beauty of the world that exists alongside these traumas. And doing this will have us collectively heal through reflection, self-love, and conscious decision-making. In the process of this mission, what we're actually doing is learning how to be more human. We've lost the richness of what it means to be human, the depth of being human. And so I would say that learning to be more human is about feeling more deeply, to think more profoundly, and to live more open-heartedly.